Delia Marsh had spent 3 years scrubbing floors on the night shift at the Ardent, Chicago's most exclusive hotel, and in all that time she'd learned one rule: never let yourself be seen. At 27, she was the woman people looked straight past, soft, heavy-set, buttoned into a gray uniform that strained a little at the seams, the kind of girl the wealthy guests handed their empty glasses to without ever meeting her eyes. Being invisible was safe. It kept the paycheck coming, and that paycheck was the only thing standing between her and the bills piling up at home. So when the night manager told her to carry fresh towels and a bottle up to the penthouse on the 40th floor, she didn't ask questions even though everyone at the Ardent knew whose floor that was. Fabian Locke, 37. Obscenely rich, and colder than the lake in January. People didn't fear him because he shouted. They feared him because he never had to. Men who crossed the Locke family didn't get warnings, they simply stopped showing up. And that night, behind that penthouse door, Fabian Locke was drunk, dangerous, and completely alone. He looked her over with those unreadable eyes, slid a check across the table, and made her an offer no woman in her right mind was supposed to accept. She should have walked out. Instead, one desperate decision, one glass of whiskey, and one long, reckless night later, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago woke up beside the invisible cleaning girl he'd never even bothered to look at twice. By morning he stood bare to the waist, whiskey already in his hand at dawn, staring at her like she was a problem he didn't know how to solve. He thought a check would make her disappear. He had no idea what that one drunken night had just set in motion, and what happened next left everyone who heard about it absolutely stunned. If stories about dignity and second chances are what you're here for, do us a small favor. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now, let's get back to the night it all began. The elevator rose to the 40th floor so smoothly that Delia could barely feel it climbing. All she could hear was her own heartbeat pounding against the collar of her uniform and feel the weight of the stack of towels draped over her arm. Then the doors slid open, and the penthouse swallowed her in its low golden light and the scent of expensive cigar smoke. Fabian Locke stood beside a floor-to-ceiling wall of glass, a drink in his hand. The entire city spread beneath him like something he owned, and he didn't turn when she entered because he had no need to. "Put them down," he said. "Then tell me who sent you." "The night shift manager, sir. Clean towels for the room." Her voice remained steady even though her hands did not. She placed the stack of towels on the marble table and turned to leave, but a single word stopped her. "Stay." He hadn't raised his voice, and that was precisely what made it frightening. She had grown up around men who shouted, and shouting was something she understood. This was different. It was a kind of silence built upon the certainty that it would be obeyed. He crossed the room slowly, studying her the way a man might study a lock he suspected someone had tampered with. And from this close he looked worse than the rumors suggested. There was a dark bruise beneath one eye. The skin across his knuckles was split, and the open collar of his shirt was stained, revealing that somewhere below, in a world she had never seen, something had gone terribly wrong tonight. "Vance sent you," he said. "It wasn't a question. I don't know who that is." "Everyone knows who he is." He set his glass down hard enough to make her flinch. "A strange face appears on my floor on the very night my men lose 2 cars and I nearly lose my life. And you expect me to believe you're here because of a few towels." "I'm here because I was ordered to come," she said. "I clean rooms. To everyone in this building, that's all I am." Something flickered across his face. Not trust, but a fracture in his certainty. He moved closer, near enough for her to smell the whiskey on his breath and, beneath it, the metallic scent of blood. His gaze traveled over her, and she braced herself for the look she knew too well, the look that swept downward before turning away in dismissal. But it never came. He was looking at her as though she were a problem, yes, but a real one. A person capable of doing something. "You're afraid of all the wrong things," he murmured. A spy would be trembling. "You're only tired. I've been standing on these feet since 6 o'clock this morning." For one long moment, neither of them moved. The city murmured 40 floors below, and beneath the threat in him, Delia saw something she had never expected to find in the man all of Chicago feared. It was a loneliness so complete that it had fallen silent, the way a wound becomes silent after a person finally stops trying to bandage it. He was a man surrounded by people who all wanted something from him, yet not one of them truly saw him. She understood that particular emptiness because she lived inside it too. "Sit down," he said, his voice gentler now. "You look like you're about to fall." She should have refused, But she sat because her legs truly were trembling, and because, absurdly, the loneliest man in Chicago had noticed. He poured a second drink and slid it across the low table toward her, while she wrapped both hands around the glass without taking a sip. "People tell stories about you downstairs," she said. "They say you make people disappear, and yet you're still sitting here." The shadow of something that wasn't quite a smile passed over his lips, saying it directly to my face. "I haven't got anything left to lose tonight, Mr. Locke. That makes a person brave, or foolish." He looked at her then, truly looked at her in a way no guest at the Ardent ever had, and whatever he saw seemed to unsettle him more deeply than any threat could have done. They were two lonely people at the top of a tower, each convinced that life had already taken away everything worth holding on to. What happened between them afterward was something neither of them had planned, and neither would ever be able to explain completely, even to themselves. It wasn't seduction, nor was it a transaction, no matter what the check on the table might have implied. It was simply two exhausted strangers reaching out, for one single time, in search of a little warmth on a night that had become unbearably cold, and finding it in the last place either of them had ever thought to look. By the time the city lights began to blur, Delia was no longer invisible to exactly one person in this world. She simply didn't yet understand how dearly that would make her pay. The check lay there on the marble table, a number written in a firm, decisive hand, $50,000. And Delia stared at it for so long that the figures seemed to blur before her eyes, because what filled her mind now wasn't the penthouse or the man who had just fallen asleep across the room, but the hospital room heavy with the smell of antiseptic where her mother lay. Wendy Marsh, the woman who had raised her with the calloused hands of a seamstress, had become little more than a fragile shape lost among hanging tubes and the low mechanical hum of the dialysis machine running through the night. Both of her kidneys had failed months ago, and 3 times each week, Delia had to watch her mother grow a little thinner. $40,000. That was the amount someone from the billing department had read to her over the phone in a voice so polite it had become almost inhuman. $40,000 for the unpaid hospital bills and the kidney transplant, without which the doctor could speak to her only with his eyes, because words no longer offered any hope. She had sold her mother's old wedding ring, worked 2 consecutive shifts without rest, knocked on the doors of every lender she could find, and been turned away because what could a hotel maid possibly offer as collateral? Each time she returned to their cramped apartment, she sat beside her mother's bed and didn't dare cry, because Wendy always knew. She would always reach for Delia's hand and whisper, "Don't worry about me, sweetheart. I've lived enough this way. You have to live your own life too." Those words echoed in Delia's mind as she picked up the check, because she knew the woman who had saved her entire life would never accept this money if she knew where it had come from, and that knowledge tightened around her chest as a hot wave of shame moved down her spine. Yet beneath that shame was something stronger, the image of her mother lying in a decent hospital bed, breathing, living for even one more season. "I've never done anything like this in my life," she whispered into the darkness, almost as though she were speaking to her mother. "I don't know whether you'll ever forgive me, but I haven't got another choice. I can't sit beside you and watch you die simply because I'm poor." She thought of all those evenings from her childhood when Wendy had gone without food and pushed her own plate toward Delia, of the nights she had stayed awake, sewing beneath a weak yellow lamp so she could buy her daughter a new pair of shoes for school, of the way she had always called Delia the gift life had given her. And Delia understood that if there was one line she was willing to cross, it was this one, for the woman who had given her a home when she had nothing and was no one. She folded the check with great care and slipped it into the inside pocket of her worn uniform jacket, and in that moment she felt as though she had lost something she could never recover. But she wouldn't allow herself to collapse. She wiped the corners of her eyes with the back of her hand, drew in a deep breath, and told herself this wasn't a fall from grace but a calculated exchange, a price she had chosen to pay in order to keep the person she loved most in this world. The man on the chaise was still asleep, his breathing heavy with liquor, and she rose and looked at him one final time, not with resentment but with a strange sense of understanding, because both of them had been buying and selling something that should never have had a price. He had bought oblivion, while she had sold away a part of her self-respect, and both of them knew exactly what they were doing. She pulled the front of her jacket into place, smoothed the wrinkles from the faded uniform, and walked toward the door with the straight-backed posture her mother had taught her as a child, her head held high even as her heart broke apart, because Wendy had always told her that people could take everything from you, but no one could take away the way you carried yourself unless you allowed them to. And when the elevator doors closed behind her, carrying her down from the 40th floor and back into the world of meager wages and sleepless nights. Delia had no idea that the money for which she had sacrificed a piece of her dignity wouldn't disappear quietly as she believed. One day, it would find its way back to her in a manner no one, not even the man sleeping in drunken silence behind her, could possibly have foreseen. The money came too late, and that was the cruelest truth Delia had to learn during the longest week of her life. Because only 3 days after she paid the outstanding hospital bills and signed the papers placing her mother on the waiting list for a kidney transplant, Wendy Marsh's heart quietly stopped while she slept. Not because of her kidneys, but because of heart failure that her exhausted body no longer had the strength to endure. And when the alarm began shrieking through the night and nurses rushed into the room, Delia had only enough time to take hold of her mother's still warm hand and whisper the words "thank you" before she understood that the woman she loved was already gone. She didn't scream or weep. She sat there for a very long time beneath the hospital's cold white lights, still holding her mother's hand. And the grief that swept over her didn't come like a storm, but like a rising sea, slow and silent, drowning her a little at a time. Because the only person in the world who had ever called her a gift was gone now, and she had returned to the same invisible existence she had known for all of her 27 years, except this time there was no one waiting for her at home. In the days that followed, she moved through every task like a machine. She paid the hospital bills, but after settling the endless, unexpected medical charges and accumulated fees that continued to pour in, the remaining money dwindled to almost nothing, barely enough for the simplest funeral. No flowers, no music. Only a decent resting place for the woman who had spent her entire life sacrificing everything for her. And Delia told herself that, even if she had to sell the last thing she owned, she would give her mother a proper burial, because Wendy deserved to leave this world with the dignity she had never been allowed to possess while she was alive. She went to a funeral home near the cemetery on the north side of the city, a solemn gray stone building called Ashgrove Memorial, which had been recommended to her as a respectable place whose prices were still within reach. And when she entered the office to sign the contract, a courteous woman placed a stack of papers and a pen in front of her, asked for the full name of the deceased and the name of the relative accepting responsibility, and Delia bent over the forms and signed, "Delia Marsh, daughter." She had nearly finished when her eyes happened to drift toward the small print at the bottom of the contract, the line no one ever bothered to read, stating that Ashgrove Memorial was a subsidiary of Locke Holdings. Her hand froze in midair, the pen trembling between her fingers, and for one moment the entire room seemed to tilt, because that name, the name she had tried to bury along with that night on the 40th floor, had appeared again beneath her fingertips, cold and undeniable. She sat in silence, her heart pounding, and a bitter laugh nearly escaped her throat, because she suddenly understood a truth so cruelly ironic that it almost felt impossible. The money she had humiliated herself to obtain, the money she had purchased by surrendering a piece of her dignity in that man's room, was now flowing directly back into his pocket, $1 at a time, through the funeral of her own mother. The woman behind the desk asked whether she was all right, and Delia merely nodded, forcing herself to complete the final letter of her signature, because she had no other choice, no time left, no money to search for another place, and the knowledge that she was being forced to entrust the body of her beloved mother to the empire of the very same man made her feel as though fate were playing some vicious joke on her, as though even death wouldn't grant her an escape from Locke's shadow, as though no matter how far she ran, or how carefully she hid, every road would eventually lead her back beneath his power. She rose, tightened her grip around the papers in her hand, and told herself that she wouldn't allow this bitter irony to stain the moment when she said goodbye to her mother. She would bury Wendy with all the dignity and reverence she could gather, and then she would keep moving forward, because that was what her mother would have wanted. Yet when she stepped through the heavy doors of Ashgrove Memorial into the cold gray afternoon, she couldn't shake the chilling feeling that the story between her and the man on the 40th floor was far from over, that the thread of fate had just been pulled into another knot, and that somewhere ahead, her path and Fabian Locke's would cross again in ways she couldn't yet begin to imagine. After the funeral, life didn't stop to wait for Delia to find her footing again. Bills continued slipping through the mail slot, and the rent on the apartment still came due with unwavering regularity, as though no one had just lost her entire world. So, only 2 weeks after placing the final handful of earth over her mother's grave, she found herself sitting once more in front of the aging computer in the hollow silence of the apartment, sending job applications in every direction, like someone casting bottles into the sea with the fragile hope that one of them might someday wash ashore. What few people knew about the invisible maid at the Ardent was that 4 years earlier, she had walked out of a university lecture hall with an honors degree in accounting in her hands. She had once dreamed of a neat desk and columns of obedient numbers. But her mother's illness had struck just as she graduated, and instead of going to interviews, she had gone to scrub floors, because cleaning work paid by the end of the week, while accounting firms interviewed her and then fell silent, perhaps because a plus-size woman with years of housekeeping listed on her resume didn't fit their image of a polished office employee. She had learned to bury that diploma at the bottom of a drawer, along with all her old dreams, until that Tuesday morning, when her phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number, and a warm, professional female voice introduced herself as calling from the Human Resources Department at Locke Group. She said they had reviewed Delia's application for an accounting specialist position and had been very impressed by her academic record and certifications, and they would like to invite her for an interview. For a moment, Delia could hardly believe what she was hearing. A corporation that large was willing to look at the application of someone who hadn't touched a ledger in 3 years, and she nearly blurted out a question, asking whether they had called the wrong person. But she caught herself, drew in a deep breath, and answered in the calmest voice she could gather that she would be very pleased to come and could be there whenever they needed her. The woman scheduled the interview for Thursday morning and sent the address by email, and after the call ended, Delia sat motionless for a very long time, still gripping the phone as though it might vanish from her hand, because for the first time in months, she felt something she had believed was lost forever: hope. A small sliver of light slipping through a crack in the darkness of her days. She took her old diploma from the bottom of the drawer, wiped the thin layer of dust from its frame, and on the night before the interview, she stayed awake until late reviewing accounting principles she had thought she had forgotten. Balance sheets, cash flows, columns of figures she had once loved because numbers were always honest, always possessed a correct answer, unlike people. On Thursday morning, she put on the only proper business outfit she owned, a blazer that had become slightly too tight, which she tugged and smoothed until it looked as presentable as possible, and she stood before the mirror, telling herself that no matter how anyone looked at her, today she would let her ability speak louder than her appearance. The interview took place in a magnificent glass skyscraper in the heart of the business district, and contrary to everything she had feared, the interviewer didn't seem to care about her figure or her years spent cleaning rooms. Instead, he focused entirely on the way she analyzed a sample financial statement, the way she caught a small discrepancy that most applicants had missed. And when she left the room, she knew she had done well, better than she had ever dared to hope. 3 days later, the second call came. It was the same warm voice, this time delivering news that made Delia drop heavily into the nearest chair. She had been hired as an accounting specialist and could begin at the start of the following week. She thanked them, her voice trembling with emotion. And when the call ended, she covered her face with both hands and began to cry. But this time the tears came from relief, from the feeling that the wheel of fate had finally turned in another direction, that perhaps she truly was being given permission to begin again. She looked up at the photograph of her mother resting on the shelf and whispered, "I did it, Mom. I'm going to stand on my own 2 feet. Delia did notice the name printed across the offer Locke Group. A cold shiver ran down her spine, remembering the funeral home contract and the man from the penthouse, but she quickly reassured herself. A conglomerate that massive employed thousands of people. The chances of ever crossing paths with Fabian Locke himself were practically zero, and this job was her only lifeline. On the final night before beginning her new position, Delia still had one last shift to complete at the Ardent, because she was a fair-minded person and didn't want to abandon her old job without giving proper notice, so she agreed to finish that final night shift, cleaning the underground parking garage beneath the hotel, a deserted, damp, cold place no one wanted to visit after midnight. She was pushing her supply cart along a row of concrete pillars when she heard the engines of 2 luxury cars glide into the garage and stop in a shadowed corner behind the emergency stairwell, where the weak yellow lights couldn't reach, and the instincts of someone who had spent her life surviving through invisibility told her to remain still, press herself behind the nearest pillar, and make no sound at all. From the darkness, she watched several men in heavy coats step out, and one of them, a tall, broad man, with a sharply angled face as cold as stone and neatly combed salt and pepper hair, leaned against the hood with the bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders, a man she would later learn was named Rourke Vance. She caught fragments of conversation drifting through the frigid air. Numbers, the names of ports, a shipment, and then the phrase that turned her blood cold, Arrangements had been made for the district police chief to look the other way. Then she saw a leather briefcase open beneath the light of a phone, its interior packed with neatly bound stacks of cash, and a thick envelope passed from the salt and pepper-haired man to another figure standing deeper in the shadows. Delia's heart pounded so violently that she feared they might hear it, and in that moment of panic she did something she couldn't later explain as courage or merely fear taking control. She pulled her old phone from her pocket, lowered the brightness of the screen as far as it would go, and began recording what was unfolding before her, her trembling hands struggling to keep the image steady as the camera captured the cold face of the salt and pepper-haired man, the briefcase filled with money, and the whispered terms of the secret agreement still echoing through the garage. She didn't know what she now held in her hands. She only sensed that this was the kind of thing someone like her should never have witnessed, the kind of secret people were willing to kill to protect. And that thought drove her even closer against the freezing pillar as she prayed for the shift to end. But just as she began backing away, hoping to slip silently toward the exit, one wheel of her supply cart caught on a piece of metal lying across the concrete and released a sharp, grinding squeal that tore through the stillness of the garage. The salt and pepper-haired man's head snapped upward at once, and his eyes swept toward the row of pillars where she was hiding, sharp as two blades cutting directly into the darkness. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, Rourke Vance's gaze stopped precisely where she stood, and although she had managed to crouch behind the pillar, although she held her breath until her lungs nearly burned, she could still feel that stare pass over the outline of her substantial figure, a silhouette the gray uniform couldn't completely conceal, and with every strand of hair rising in terror, she knew he had caught a glimpse of someone standing there. He said something to his men in a low, calm voice that was more frightening than a shout, and one of them began walking toward the pillars, the strike of his leather shoes against the concrete sounding one measured beat at a time, like a countdown. Then, at that exact moment, the horn of a hotel security vehicle on patrol echoed down the ramp leading from the street, and the entire group suddenly stopped, exchanging quick nods before climbing back into their cars. The two vehicles glided out of the garage as silently as they had entered, leaving Delia collapsed on the cold floor, trembling uncontrollably, the phone still clutched tightly in her hand with the recording intact. She remained there for a long time in the mute darkness of the garage, struggling to steady her breathing, telling herself she would delete the video, forget everything she had just seen, and move forward into her new life. But there was one thing she couldn't erase: the chilling certainty that the knife-sharp eyes of that man had already carved her image into his memory, and that the accidental recording now hidden inside her pocket was nothing less than a time bomb whose moment of detonation she couldn't possibly know. On Monday morning, Delia stepped into the lobby of Lock Group, with her heart beating fast for a reason entirely different from the night before. This time, it was the pure nervous excitement of a new beginning. She wore her neatest blazer, carried a slim portfolio beneath one arm, and told herself that from this day forward, she would become a different person, an accounting specialist, rather than an invisible maid, that the past had been buried behind her along with the night on the 40th floor, and the video she had sworn never to open again. The human resources representative guided her through gleaming stone corridors, introduced her to her future colleagues, and showed her the desk that would belong to her beside a window flooded with sunlight. Delia had begun to feel something almost like happiness, a sense that she might finally belong somewhere, until the representative explained that, according to company tradition, every new employee was taken to meet senior management on the first day, and she was escorted into an elevator that carried them directly to the executive floor. When the doors opened, they revealed a level entirely unlike the rest of the building, silent and luxuriously cold, with dark wood-paneled walls and low lighting that, for reasons she couldn't explain, sent a vague warning shivering down her spine. When they reached the double doors of the chairman's office, the human resources representative knocked softly, pushed them open, and introduced Delia as the new accounting specialist with such respectful pride that Delia nearly smiled. But that smile died on her lips the instant the man behind the enormous wooden desk raised his head, because she had seen that face before. Those unreadable eyes, that motionless posture radiating quiet authority, at a distance so intimate it still hurt to remember, inside a penthouse on the 40th floor. In a single heartbeat, Delia's entire world seemed to collapse as she realized that the man seated before her, the owner of this building and of the job she had welcomed like salvation, was none other than Fabian Locke. Her throat went dry, a roar filled her ears, and only one thought remained in her mind, repeating again and again like a funeral bell. She had slept with this powerful man. She had taken his check. And now she was standing before him as one of his employees. Dear God, he was going to destroy her. He would believe she had deliberately followed his trail and attached herself to him, that she was precisely the kind of woman he had warned her he despised, the kind who clung to a man and refused to let go. On Fabian's side, the shock appeared during the first instant and vanished so quickly that only a woman who had once looked directly into his eyes on that night could have recognized it. His gaze narrowed slightly, the muscles along his jaw tightened, and the hand holding his pen stopped above the page, because he had recognized her immediately as well. The woman he had believed a check would be enough to erase from his life was now standing in the middle of his office with a brand new employee badge she hadn't even had time to put on. Neither of them spoke, and it was that silence that became almost unbearable. A silence stretched as tightly as a string about to snap, containing an entire secret night, a check, a burden of shame, and a storm of suspicion compressed together without any way to break into words. Between them stood the human resources representative, completely unaware of the hidden earthquake unfolding before her, still cheerfully listing the achievements recorded in Delia's application. Fabian was the first to recover his composure. He lowered the pen very slowly, his eyes still fixed on Delia with an expression so unreadable that it frightened her, neither angry nor surprised, only coldly attentive, as though he were recalculating every move on the board. Then he gave a slight nod and spoke only 3 words in his low, even voice. "Welcome to the company." Those words should have been nothing more than harmless courtesy, yet they struck Delia like a sentence being passed, because she understood that beneath his calm exterior, an entire storm was waiting to be released. The human resources representative led her back outside, while Delia moved like a shadow, her legs stiff and the roaring still filling her ears. When the elevator doors closed and carried her back down toward the sunlit desk that only minutes earlier had seemed filled with hope, she knew that the new beginning she had mistaken for salvation had only pushed her deeper into the very labyrinth she had so desperately tried to escape. Delia's first days at Lock Group should have been a time for learning the job and finding her place, but she quickly discovered that some invisible walls were even harder to cross than her fear of running into Fabian, because on that bright office floor filled with glass desks, people had already heard whispers about her past before she had been given any chance to prove who she was. It began with an employee named Priscilla, the longest-serving member of the department and a woman whose eyes always seemed to look down on everyone else. When she happened to recognize Delia as the woman who had once pushed a cleaning cart through the Ardent, the hotel her husband often visited, and within a single morning, the news had spread across the accounting department, like oil over water, turning Delia from a new colleague into a source of entertainment. People began whispering behind her whenever she passed, their quiet laughter dying the moment she turned around, and someone deliberately spoke just loudly enough for her to hear, wondering when the company's hiring standards had fallen so low that even a cleaning girl could slip into the accounting department, adding that she must possess some special secret for climbing higher than ordinary people ever could. Priscilla was the cruelest of them all. She had a way of looking Delia up and down, letting her gaze linger far too long on Delia's full waist and slightly tight blazer, then delivering cutting remarks wrapped carefully in the false sweetness of concern. "That office chair must be a little small for you. Shouldn't I ask someone to bring you a larger one?" she would say. Or, "How do you manage to keep such a distinctive figure?" always accompanied by a smile so sugary and poisonous that the people around her would begin to snicker. One day, someone secretly stuck a small note to Delia's computer screen with a scrawled message suggesting that the freight elevator in the back was where she truly belonged. And on another occasion, as she carried a stack of files past the coffee area, she heard Priscilla clearly telling her little circle of followers that someone like Delia was fit only to wipe down a desk, not sit behind one, that with an appearance like hers and a background in cleaning, everyone had to wonder who she had slept with to force her way inside. Every remark felt like a needle driven into the most painful part of Delia, not because she had never heard such things before, but because she had heard them all her life, from the days when she had been a heavy child mocked by her classmates to adulthood, when people looked straight through her as though she didn't exist. And now that old, aching wound was being torn open again in the very place where she had placed all her hope for a decent new beginning. Yet what surprised and irritated people like Priscilla was that Delia didn't react the way they expected. She didn't shout, didn't cry in front of them, and didn't throw herself into an argument that would give them an excuse to label her a troublemaker. Instead, she quietly lowered the stack of files, lifted her head, and looked directly at Priscilla with such calmness that the woman faltered, then spoke in a soft but unmistakably clear voice. "I was hired because of my bachelor's degree in accounting and because of how I performed in my interview. As for the fact that I once cleaned floors to support my sick mother, I have nothing to be ashamed of. You may look down on that work, but it was honest, and it kept me alive when no one else was willing to give me a chance." She didn't raise her voice or speak with bitterness, but her words carried such weight that the entire group, already preparing to laugh, fell silent, because there was a kind of dignity in her composure that money and status couldn't buy, something the very people mocking her seemed to lack. Unable to find an answer, Priscilla merely gave a dismissive sound and turned sharply away. Delia returned to her desk, sat down, and ignored the slight trembling of her hands as humiliation rose inside her chest, but she wouldn't allow it to reach her eyes. She opened her spreadsheet and began working, burying herself in honest, impartial numbers that never cared how much she weighed or where she had come from. And in the quiet of her heart, she promised herself that she would prove her worth not through words, but through the quality of her work, that one day the people who looked down on her now would be forced to see her differently. What she didn't know was that day, along with the man who would witness the moment she held her head high before a crowd of mockers, was much closer than she could possibly imagine. At the end of that first work week, when most of the employees had already gone home and only a scattered few lights remained across the floor, Delia received a brief message from the executive office asking her to come up to the chairman's office, and she knew this moment had been inevitable. The private confrontation both of them had spent the past several days avoiding through cold nods exchanged in the hallways. So she drew in a deep breath, straightened the front of her jacket, and stepped into the elevator bound for the executive floor, with the resolve of someone who knew she was about to face the worst. Fabian stood beside the window with his back to her, the city glowing behind him exactly as it had on that fateful night, and when he turned, there was no bruise on his face, and none of the drunken exhaustion she remembered, only the cold composure of a man accustomed to controlling everything around him. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, but she remained standing, and he didn't insist. Instead, he placed a check on the glass surface and pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. In his low, even voice, he said he didn't know how she had arranged to slip into his company, but he didn't believe in coincidences, and he wasn't the kind of man who allowed a mistake from his past to linger around him. So there it was, $100,000, twice what she had accepted that night, and in exchange she would submit her resignation before the day was over, leave the city, and make certain he never had to see her face again. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the distant murmur of the city below, and Delia looked down at the check lying before her. The amount was more than she had ever dreamed of possessing, enough to pay every debt she owed, enough to begin again somewhere no one knew her name, and the powerful man standing before her had surely assumed that a poor woman like her would seize it without hesitation, just as she had taken the check on that desperate night. But this time was different, because her mother was gone now. There was no one left for whom Delia had to sell away her dignity in order to save, and the only thing she still possessed was the self-respect the world had spent her entire life trying to tear from her hands. She lifted her head, looked directly into Fabian Locke's unreadable eyes, and pushed the check back toward him with a slow, deliberate motion. Her voice didn't tremble when she said, "The last time I took your money, it was because my mother was dying, and I had no other choice. It was the most humiliating thing I have ever done, and I will carry it with me for the rest of my life. But my mother is gone now, and with her, the part of me that could be purchased with money died too." Fabian frowned, perhaps because this was the first time in many years that anyone had dared return his money, and she continued, "I entered this company because of my degree and my ability, not because I wanted to attach myself to you. I didn't even know this was your company until I walked into your office on Monday morning. And if you believe that throwing money at people gives you the power to order anyone to do whatever you want, then you're wrong, because money doesn't make you human, Mr. Locke. Money doesn't give you the right to trample on someone else's dignity simply because you possess more of it than they do." She paused, her chest rising and falling, but her gaze remained steady, and then she lowered her voice for the final words. "You may turn people into things to be bought and sold, and you may continue believing you're always right, but you can't buy respect. You can't buy control over me, and you will never be able to buy the feeling of having someone look at you as a real human being instead of nothing more than a wallet that learned how to walk." When she finished, she stepped back, gave him a small nod that was polite enough to feel cold, then turned and walked out without looking behind her, leaving the check abandoned on the glass desk, and leaving the most powerful man in Chicago standing motionless in his own office, unable to speak for the first time in his life. His unreadable eyes followed the straight, unbroken line of the woman's back as she walked away after refusing what the entire city would have fallen to its knees to obtain. And somewhere deep inside him, something had been shaken in a way he couldn't yet name. For many nights after the evening, Delia pushed the check back across the desk and walked out of the room without looking behind her. Fabian Locke found himself unable to drive that image from his mind, the straight, unbroken posture of a woman who had just refused an amount of money the entire city would have fallen to its knees to possess. Because throughout all the years he had sat at the summit of an empire built upon fear, he had become accustomed to reading people within seconds. He knew who could be bought, who could be intimidated, who would betray someone the moment a higher price was offered, and that cold formula had never failed him until she appeared and shattered it. He had ordered an investigation into her, not because he was suspicious, as he kept telling himself, but because of a curiosity he didn't want to admit even to himself. And what Colton Shaw, his quiet and loyal right-hand man, placed upon his desk only left him more confused, because there was no conspiracy hidden in that file. Only an honors degree in accounting that had been left unused, an adoptive mother who had recently died after suffering from kidney failure, a stack of hospital bills paid with the exact amount of money he had given Delia that night, and a life filled with hardship in which there wasn't a single stain except for the night she had been forced to surrender her dignity in an attempt to save her mother. Fabian sat beneath the glow of his desk lamp for a very long time with that file open before him, and he realized that what haunted him wasn't the fact that she had accepted his money, but the fact that she had returned it, because in his world, where loyalty was measured in dollars and every relationship was a transaction, her integrity seemed almost irrational, a strange kind of light he hadn't seen in a very long time, perhaps not since before he had become the man he was now. He wouldn't allow himself to call it emotion. He was Fabian Locke. Men like him didn't feel moved. They calculated. So he convinced himself that he merely respected an opponent who had made a move he hadn't anticipated. Yet his actions afterward betrayed that cold reasoning, because he began watching over her in a way he had never done with any other employee. When Colton happened to mention that a group of people in the accounting department were trying to blame her for a mistake she hadn't made in order to force her out of the company, Fabian quietly ordered a complete review of the records and discovered that Priscilla was the one who had altered the figures, and after a brief conversation no one else knew had taken place. The woman who had mocked Delia so relentlessly suddenly stopped all her cruel games and requested a transfer to another branch. Delia had no idea why the people who had once looked down on her had suddenly become cautious around her, nor did she understand why she was being entrusted with more important assignments, even though she had only recently joined the company. She merely sensed that some invisible hand was quietly clearing the path before her, and she couldn't possibly have imagined that the hand belonged to the very man she believed wanted to drive her away. But Fabian's world wasn't made only of files and meetings. It also had a darker side, one he always kept far from the bright, polished office building. And during those nights when he sat in a sealed room with Colton discussing shipments at the harbor, money that had to be moved discreetly, and the name Rourke Vance, who was pressing deeper into Locke territory with secret arrangements and threats that were no longer disguised, Fabian found himself thinking about Delia in a strange way, not as a concern related to business, but as a reminder that another version of him had once existed. A man who had lived before this empire transformed him into the figure the entire city feared. He understood better than anyone how dangerous his world was, that the instant Vance sensed he had a weakness, someone he cared about, that person would immediately become a piece on the board for him to use, and because of that, Fabian told himself he had to keep his distance from her, that she must remain nothing more than a name on the payroll. Yet every time he passed the sunlit section where her desk stood and saw her bent over her work, absorbed in the honesty of numbers, he felt that cold determination fracture a little further, as though for the first time in many years, something inside him was quietly awakening, something he both longed for and feared, because he understood that in the world he ruled, caring about another person wasn't a gift. It was a fatal vulnerability. Late one evening in the middle of the week, when Delia left the building after staying behind to finish an important financial statement, Chicago was suddenly struck by a bitterly cold rain, the kind of late autumn storm that drove slanting sheets of water through the streetlights, and she stood beneath the narrow shelter of a bus stop, pulling the collar of her thin coat higher around her neck and shivering as she waited for the bus. The electronic sign said, "Wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. She didn't notice the black luxury car gliding toward the curb until the window lowered, and that familiar deep voice reached her through the curtain of rain, asking whether she intended to stand there until she froze to death. And Delia turned, stunned to find Fabian behind the wheel, alone, without a driver or bodyguards, only him and those unreadable eyes watching her across the rain-soaked space between them. She meant to refuse, meant to say she could wait for the bus, but he had already leaned across to open the passenger door and said in a tone that left no room for argument, "Get in. I haven't got time to watch one of my employees catch pneumonia." In the end, she climbed inside, closed the door, and sat close to the edge of the warm leather seat, leaving behind the rain and the safety of the distance she had tried so carefully to keep between them. Inside the confined space of the car, with the rain tapping steadily against the glass roof and the windshield wipers moving back and forth with a faint squeal, a silence settled around them that was so tense it became difficult to breathe, because the last time they had been this close was in the room on the 40th floor, and both of them knew it. Both of them could still feel that dangerous pull between them, unchanged no matter how determinedly they tried to deny it. Fabian drove slowly through streets shining with water, and he was the one who finally broke the silence. Without taking his eyes from the road, he said that he had read her file, that he knew about her mother, and that he was sorry for the evening when he had offered her the check. He said he had been wrong to believe every person could be measured by the same standard, and Delia turned to look at him, too astonished to speak, because she had never imagined that a man like him could utter the words, "I'm sorry." Perhaps it was the darkness inside the car, or perhaps it was the rain sealing them away from the outside world, that made it easier for him to open himself, because after another stretch of silence, he quietly said that he had lost someone too. Not his mother, but his younger sister, and the way his voice softened when he spoke those two words made Delia understand that she had reached the deepest wound this man carried. He told her, slowly and in fragments, as though every word had to be drawn up from somewhere buried far below, that many years earlier, when he was still a boy, the Locke family had become entangled in a bloody purge with a rival organization, and during the chaos, his little sister, a girl only 4 years old, had disappeared after a highway accident, though no body was ever found. For all those years, his entire family had lived beneath the weight of an unanswered nightmare, never knowing whether the child was dead or alive, whether she had been taken or had somehow become lost somewhere in the vastness of the city. He said that the day his sister disappeared had driven the Locke family deeper into darkness, had turned his father into a ruthless man, and had transformed Fabian himself into something he had never wanted to become. He told her that the girl had carried one mark no one in the family had ever forgotten, a small birthmark shaped like a bird, with its wings spread, resting just below her left shoulder blade, the mark his mother had kissed every night before the child went to sleep. Delia listened with compassion rising inside her chest, unaware that her own hand had moved instinctively toward her left shoulder beneath the coat, where she too carried a birthmark her adoptive mother, Wendy, had always called the sign of an angel, and she thought only how strange it was that a man so powerful and cold could carry such profoundly human pain inside him, making him seem closer, more real, and more vulnerable than any rumor had ever suggested. When the car stopped in front of her aging apartment building, they remained in silence for another moment beneath the sound of the rain, and Fabian turned to look at her with an expression that, for the first time, held no calculation or suspicion, only naked weariness and loneliness. Then he softly thanked her for listening, saying he didn't understand why he had told her these things, when she was the person from whom he should have kept the greatest distance. And Delia gave him a sad smile, and replied that perhaps sometimes people needed to tell a stranger the things they couldn't tell anyone else. Then she stepped from the car and disappeared into the rain, completely unaware that the bird-shaped birthmark on her shoulder had just quietly connected two people who had seemed separated by an entire chasm of fate. What Delia didn't know was that from the night in the Ardent's basement onward, Rourke Vance's knife-sharp eyes hadn't stopped searching for the substantial silhouette he had briefly glimpsed behind the concrete pillar, and through covert connections that reached deep into the personnel systems of hotels and corporations across the city, he had discovered that the witness to his transaction that night was a former maid who had since become an accountant, and what caught his attention most was that she now worked for Locke Group, the territory of his most bitter enemy. To a calculating man like Vance, this wasn't merely a threat that needed to be erased, but a heaven-sent opportunity to strike two blows at once. He could silence the dangerous witness who possessed a recording capable of sending him to prison, while also using her as a blade to drive into Fabian Locke's side. So he decided to make his move. but in the most cruelly calculated manner only men who had spent their entire lives in darkness could devise. He didn't touch Delia. He targeted the only person she still considered a friend in this world, Nora Bishop, the kind former colleague from the Ardent who had warned Delia about the name Locke on that fateful night, who still occasionally sent messages to ask how she was doing and invited her to coffee. One late afternoon, as Nora finished her shift and stepped through the rear entrance of the hotel, an unmarked vehicle pulled alongside the curb, and she vanished from the street within a few brief seconds before anyone had time to notice. That evening, Delia's phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number, and when she answered, a man's deep, rough voice, horrifying in its calmness, spoke her name directly into her ear. He told her he knew what she had recorded in the basement that night, and that if she wanted to see her friend Nora returned unharmed, she would bring the phone containing the video to an address he would send her, alone, without contacting the police, and without telling anyone. Otherwise, he couldn't promise what might happen to the poor woman. Then he handed over the phone, and Delia heard Nora sobbing her name in terror, begging her to save her. Before the call ended abruptly, leaving Delia standing motionless in the emptiness of her apartment, with her heart crushed beneath what felt like an icy hand, because she understood at once that her innocent friend was paying the price for something Delia had witnessed by accident, a burden she had never wanted to carry. In her overwhelming panic, Delia nearly did exactly as he demanded, grabbing the phone and rushing alone toward that deadly address. But one final thread of reason held her back. She understood that a man like Vance would never allow either her or Nora to survive once he had the recording in his possession, and that she needed the help of the only person in the city powerful enough to stand against him, even though he was the man from whom she had told herself she must keep her distance at any cost. She raced to the Locke Group building in the middle of the night, ran through the deserted corridors, and when the chairman's office door flew open, she stumbled inside and poured out the entire story between broken breaths. The night in the basement, the video, the phone call, and Nora being held somewhere against her will. She watched Fabian's face darken with every word, the muscles along his jaw tightening until the tendons stood out, while his usually unreadable eyes burned with a cold fire she had never seen before. When she spoke the name Rourke Vance, his entire body went rigid like a steel cable pulled to its limit, because he immediately understood that this was no ordinary threat, but a move calculated to strike directly at him. Vance had used Delia's innocent friend as a hostage, and Delia herself as bait, knowing perfectly well that this was the surest way to force Fabian out of the shadows and make him expose himself. Fabian rose, and in that moment, the man who had always tried to keep his underground world far from this bright office building had no choice but to let it come flooding in. He summoned Colton Shaw with a brief, cold command, then turned toward the trembling Delia and told her in a voice low but solid as stone that she needed to listen carefully. She wasn't going to that meeting place alone, and Vance was about to be reminded of something he had forgotten long ago, the price a man paid when he dared to touch someone Fabian Locke had chosen to protect. The address Vance sent was an abandoned warehouse along the river on the south side of the city, a dark concrete structure standing among rusted shipping containers and flickering floodlights, and Fabian had drawn up a plan with cold precision, down to the smallest detail. He allowed Delia to go to the meeting place exactly as Vance had ordered, carrying the phone. But she wouldn't be alone as he believed, because all around her in the darkness, Fabian's men, led by Colton Shaw, had quietly moved into position from every direction, and Fabian himself was there, concealed behind stacks of cargo, his eyes never leaving her trembling figure as she walked into the mouth of the trap. Delia stepped through the rusted steel door with her heart pounding violently, and beneath the weak yellow light, she saw Nora bound to a chair in the center of the warehouse, tape covering her mouth, her eyes wide with terror and flooded with tears, while Rourke Vance stood nearby, leaning casually against a steel column with the confidence of a man certain he had already won, several of his men drifting around him like shadows. He gave a mocking laugh when he saw her, praised her for being a sensible girl, then held out his hand for the phone, and the instant Delia hesitated, he signaled to one of his men, who tightened the rope around Nora's wrists until her friend cried out in pain through the tape, a wordless warning that he could turn the evening into a tragedy in a matter of seconds. But just as he reached for the phone, the entire warehouse suddenly fell into darkness when Colton cut the power, and in that brief moment of confusion, Fabian's men surged in from every direction with the silent precision of people who had done this many times before. The sounds of footsteps, struggling bodies, and sharp, controlled blows echoed through the blackness, And when beams of flashlights swept across the warehouse, Vance's men had already been subdued, while Vance himself was pinned against the same steel column he had leaned upon so arrogantly, Colton holding him there with unyielding force. Dahlia rushed to Nora, trembling as she tore away the tape and loosened the ropes, then pulled her sobbing friend into her arms. As she held Nora tightly, she looked up and saw a version of Fabian Locke she had never witnessed before, not the quiet man behind the wooden desk, nor the lonely man who had opened his heart inside a car beneath the rain, but a true underworld boss stepping out of the darkness, moving with unhurried calm while radiating a deadly authority. And when he stopped before Vance, the entire space seemed to freeze. He didn't strike him. He didn't need to. He simply stood there looking down at his enemy with eyes as cold as ice, and said in a low voice that chilled the air that Vance had made his final mistake when he chose to harm an innocent person in order to play games with him. And the way Vance shrank beneath that gaze showed Delia just how terrifying Fabian's true power was. A power that could make even the cruelest men tremble without spilling a single drop of blood. She stood there with her heart still racing, caught between two opposing emotions tearing through her at once. On one side, she was horrified by the ruthless underworld she had just seen with her own eyes. A world where people could be tied to chairs, and human lives could be used as bargaining chips. On the other, she couldn't deny that the man who belonged to that world had just risked his own life to save her innocent friend. And he had done it not with blind brutality, but with cold, calculated restraint. What troubled her most, and what made her begin to see him differently, came when one of his men suggested that they should deal with Vance immediately and end the threat for good. And Fabian shook his head. He said he wasn't Vance, that he would allow justice and the law to speak in their own way, and that fragile but genuine moral line, the boundary he had somehow preserved for himself, no matter how deeply he had fallen into darkness, showed Delia that beneath the ruthless exterior of the feared boss, a faint spark of humanity still remained, not yet completely consumed by the shadows. As they helped Nora out of the warehouse and into the freezing night, Delia looked back at Fabian's silhouette as he stood among the chaos, watching Vance slip away into the shadows during the melee while his henchmen were apprehended, and she understood that from this night forward, she could no longer see him simply as a monster or a savior, but as a complicated man balancing dangerously between two worlds, a man she found herself being drawn toward more deeply with every passing day. A few days after the night at the warehouse, once Nora had returned safely and the video had been entrusted to someone Fabian trusted until the right moment came to present it to the authorities, Delia found herself sitting alone in her empty apartment late at night, and instead of relief, a quiet fear kept rising inside her chest, because she had now seen with her own eyes the world into which she was slowly being drawn, a world where people were tied to chairs inside abandoned warehouses, where a single phone call could decide whether someone lived or died, and she realized that as long as she remained beside Fabian Locke, as long as she allowed her heart to lean toward him, she and everyone she loved would forever remain pieces in bloody games she could never fully understand. That fear drove her toward a painful decision. She wrote a letter of resignation, gathered the few belongings she owned, and planned to leave the city quietly, hoping to begin again somewhere without darkness, without names that made people tremble, somewhere she could live an ordinary, anonymous life like the one she had always known. But just as she placed the letter on the table, Fabian appeared, as though he had sensed her intentions before she had even acted upon them. He stood in the doorway of her small apartment, and for the first time since she had known him, he no longer looked like a powerful boss, but like a man standing on the edge of losing something he couldn't bear to lose. His eyes fell to the letter in her hand before lifting to her face, and in a rough voice he asked whether she truly intended to leave without saying even one word to him. Delia struggled to keep her voice from trembling. She told him she had to go, that the night at the warehouse had shown her clearly that she didn't belong in his world, that she was only an ordinary accountant who couldn't live a life in which a gun might be pointed at someone she loved at any moment, and that if she stayed, sooner or later she would destroy both him and herself, so it was better for her to disappear before everything went too far. She expected him to become angry, to give a cold nod and let her go the way he discarded anything that was no longer useful, because that was how she understood him. But instead, Fabian stepped closer, and the man who had never begged anyone for anything throughout his powerful life did something that seemed to astonish even him. He reached out and took hold of her wrist. Not tightly, only firmly enough to keep her from walking away. And in a deep voice now fractured at the edges, he said, "Please don't go." Those words, spoken by a man before whom the entire city bent its knee, carried such weight that the room itself seemed to stop breathing, and he continued, slowly and without defenses, as though he were stripping away each layer of armor he had worn for years. He told her that all his life, he had lived in a world where people came to him only because they wanted something, money, power, protection, or because they feared him, and he had grown so accustomed to it that he had convinced himself he didn't need anyone, until she appeared and looked at him in a way no one ever had, as a human being rather than a name. He told her she was the first person who had ever returned his money, the first who had dared to tell him directly that money didn't make him human, and those words had haunted him every night, because they were true, because he had lost his humanity a very long time ago, and she was the only person who had made him want to find it again. If she left, he said, she would take with her the fragile piece of humanity he had only just begun to remember he once possessed. Delia stood there with her throat closing and tears gathering in her eyes, because she could feel the naked truth in every word he spoke. But that only made the pain deeper, and she slowly shook her head, telling him that his feelings couldn't erase the truth that his world was too dangerous, that she couldn't live beneath the constant weight of fear, and that sometimes two people, no matter how deeply they wanted each other, couldn't remain together when an entire abyss stood between them. Then she gently pulled her wrist from his hand, and the moment his fingers fell away, helpless and trembling, revealed that even the most powerful man in the city still faced things power could never buy or hold on to, while the conflict between their two hearts remained suspended between them, unresolved, like a wound left open. Delia didn't leave immediately as she had planned, because her resignation letter remained untouched on the Human Resources Director's desk, a letter she still hadn't found the courage to submit, and some part of her, no matter how fiercely she tried to deny it, couldn't bring herself to walk away after the raw and unguarded words Fabian had spoken. So she lingered for a few more days, telling herself she needed time to put everything in order before truly beginning again, and it was that hesitation that carried her toward a turning point no one in this story could possibly have foreseen. One weekend afternoon, Fabian invited her to dine at the Locke family estate beside the lake, a grand and imposing old residence where, he said, it was time for her to meet his family, not as an employee, but as someone he deeply valued, and although her heart was still crowded with uncertainty, Delia accepted, partly because she was curious about the roots of this complicated man, and partly because she felt she owed him at least a proper goodbye. During dinner, she was introduced to Marguerite Locke, an elegant older woman with silver hair swept into a high bun and eyes touched by a deep sorrow she couldn't conceal. And from the very first moment, Delia noticed the woman's gaze lingering on her face longer than it should have, searching, hesitant, as though she were struggling to remember something faint and distant from long ago. Leaving Delia slightly uneasy without understanding why, the meal unfolded with formal grace yet an unexpected warmth until a small accident occurred. As Delia reached for her napkin, she knocked over her glass of water, and while hurriedly trying to clean the spill, the thin shawl covering her shoulders slipped down, revealing the upper part of her left shoulder blade, where a small, pale brown birthmark rested. At that exact moment, Marguerite's knife and fork fell onto the table with a sharp clatter, her entire face turning as white as paper, her eyes widening as she stared at the mark on Delia's shoulder as though a ghost had stepped out of the past. Delia quickly pulled the shawl back into place and apologized for her clumsiness. But Marguerite no longer seemed to hear her. She rose abruptly from her chair, approached Delia on trembling legs, and in a voice breaking with emotion, asked, "That birthmark, how long have you had it, child?" Then, without waiting for an answer, she gently moved the shawl aside once more with a shaking hand so she could see it clearly. And when the full shape of the mark appeared, something resembling the spread wings of a bird, she began sobbing, both hands covering her mouth as though trying to hold back a cry that threatened to tear free. The entire table fell silent. Fabian stood, staring at his mother in bewilderment, and Marguerite, tears streaming down her face, turned toward him and whispered, "This birthmark, Fabian, don't you remember? This is Adeline's birthmark, the bird-shaped mark on her shoulder that I kissed every night, the mark I have carried in my heart since the day she was taken from us, without forgetting it for a single moment." Fabian went completely still, his gaze moving from his mother's tear-soaked face to the birthmark on Delia's shoulder and back again, and the story he had told Delia on that rainy night flashed through his mind. The story of his 4-year-old sister, who had vanished after the accident, of the bird-shaped birthmark no one in the family had ever forgotten, and now it was there before his eyes on the shoulder of the woman, for whom he had already begun to feel something far too deep, a terrifying coincidence that sent coldness down his spine. Delia stood there utterly stunned, stammering that she had carried the birthmark since childhood, that her adoptive mother Wendy had always called it the sign of an angel, but that she had never known where she had been born because Wendy had adopted her when she was still very young, and every word she spoke made Marguerite tremble more violently, because all the vague pieces were beginning to fit together in a way no one in the room dared to believe. The patriarch of the family, Cornelius Locke, who had remained silent at the head of the table throughout the meal, now slowly lowered his wineglass, his aged eyes narrowing thoughtfully as he studied Delia, and there was something in his expression that seemed both deeply moved and strangely unreadable, as though he were witnessing something he had been quietly waiting for a very long time to see. Yet none of them dared to speak aloud the possibility hanging in the air, because a birthmark, no matter how astonishingly similar, couldn't be considered proof, and the earth-shaking truth that might alter all their destinies still remained there, waiting to be revealed. What Delia had no idea of when she entered the Locke estate that day was that recently another woman had been living in that house, claiming to be the long-lost Adeline Locke, a young woman named Bianca Frost, who had appeared not long ago with an elaborately constructed story about the missing child, supported by suspicious documents and several details accurate enough to stir the desperate heart of a mother who had mourned her daughter for 2 decades. And since then, Bianca had lived amid the luxury of the family, enjoying every privilege granted to a Locke heiress who had seemingly returned from the dead. Bianca hadn't been present at the dinner when Delia arrived, but when news of the bird-shaped birthmark reached her, the entire life of wealth she had worked so carefully to build began to sway beneath her feet, because during her time there, she had desperately manipulated the grieving mother's emotions, offering excuse after excuse to delay any blood testing, and now the appearance of a woman bearing the one mark Bianca couldn't possibly counterfeit had driven her into a corner. Bianca came at once, storming into the sitting room where Marguerite was still trembling, and with outrage performed so skillfully that it almost seemed genuine. She accused Delia of being a shameless fraud who had caught the scent of the Locke fortune and was trying to force her way into the family. She wept as she clung to Marguerite, crying, "Mother, please don't let this woman deceive you. I'm your Adeline." The performance was so convincing that for one moment, even Marguerite faltered between the two women, her mother's heart torn apart by the unbearable question of whom she should believe. But the man seated at the head of the table, Cornelius Locke, who had lived long enough to see through the hearts of others, and had quietly carried doubts about Bianca for a long time, without ever finding the proper opportunity to expose her, finally spoke. He said it was time to end all uncertainty through a method no one could dispute, and he proposed a series of tests based upon memories only the real Adeline could carry within her, small and deeply personal details that even the most thoroughly prepared imposter would struggle to know. He began by ordering someone to bring out a plate of pastries sprinkled with peanuts, then reminded the room that little Adeline had suffered from such a severe peanut allergy that she had nearly died after accidentally eating them when she was 3 years old. He invited both women to taste one, and while Bianca casually lifted a pastry toward her mouth without the slightest hesitation, Delia stopped, apologized, and refused, explaining that she couldn't eat peanuts because her throat would swell and she would struggle to breathe. Her response was so honest and instinctive that it couldn't have been acted, and Bianca's face briefly changed color. Cornelius continued by handing each woman a pen and asking them to sign their names on a sheet of paper. Bianca smoothly took the pen in her right hand, while Delia naturally held hers in her left, and Marguerite cried out that her Adeline had been left-handed, that the child had always held her spoon and pencil with her left hand from the time she first began walking, a detail she had never told anyone and one that didn't appear in any document an imposter could have studied. Then, as though heaven itself had chosen to take part in the confrontation, a sudden storm gathered beyond the windows, one of the final storms of the season. Lightning split the sky, followed by a peal of thunder so powerful that it shook the entire room, and at that instant, Delia flinched violently, the color draining from her face, as both hands flew to cover her ears, and her entire body began trembling with an instinctive terror she couldn't control. It took her a long moment to calm herself, while Bianca remained sitting there with an unnatural composure, and Marguerite's tears began flowing once more, as she said through a broken voice that her Adeline had been so terrified of thunder that on every stormy night, the little girl would crawl into her arms and cry, and that was why Marguerite had always held her so tightly whenever the weather changed. 3 tests, 3 times. Delia responded exactly as the real Adeline would have without knowing what any of it meant, and 3 times Bianca revealed small but fatal mistakes. The atmosphere in the sitting room slowly shifted from uncertainty into a chilling sense of conviction, and the confidence Bianca had always worn began to crack. Her eyes darted around the room in search of an escape, while the elegant performance she had maintained for so long began to reveal the panic of someone about to be Cornelius looked at Bianca with the cold, penetrating eyes of a man who had finally seen everything clearly. He said he had suspected her for a long time but had continued giving her a chance because of Marguerite's love, and now the truth had become far too obvious. Yet he still wanted one final piece of evidence that couldn't be denied, something that would bring the matter to an end once and for all, a DNA test, and he declared that it would be carried out immediately. The announcement drained every trace of color from Bianca's face, because she understood better than anyone that the day she had spent so long desperately delaying had finally arrived, and once the results were revealed, the entire fortress of lies she had so carefully constructed would collapse into ruins, bringing down with it all the dark schemes she had been hiding within her heart. While they waited for the DNA test to be completed, Cornelius Locke summoned an elderly man to the estate. His name was Mr. Halloran, the old chauffeur who had served the Locke family since his youth and had been retired for many years. The man Cornelius remembered had been present on the fateful day little Adeline disappeared. When the old man entered with the unsteady steps of age, clutching a weathered tin box tightly in his arms, everyone in the room sensed that an important piece of the past was about to be revealed. Mr. Halloran placed the box on the table, opened the lid with his wrinkled hands, and inside lay a leather-bound notebook worn along the edges and a tiny silver child's bracelet tarnished by the passing years. With trembling fingers, he lifted the bracelet and handed it to Marguerite. And when the light fell upon its inner surface, 2 delicately engraved letters became visible. A and L, the initials of Adeline Locke. Marguerite broke into uncontrollable sobs and pressed the bracelet against her chest as though she were holding the lost child herself. The old man began to recount, his voice choked with emotion, what had happened on that terrible night 23 years earlier, when the Locke family convoy was ambushed on the highway, and a devastating crash erupted amid the chaos of a violent gang purge. He had been the survivor who crawled from the wreckage, and through the smoke and flames, he had witnessed something he would bury in silence for the rest of his life. He said that amid the destruction, he saw an ordinary woman in simple clothing, perhaps no more than a passerby who had happened upon the scene, risk her life by rushing toward the smoking vehicle and pulling out a small unconscious girl, a child with a bird-shaped birthmark on her shoulder and a silver bracelet around her wrist. When the woman saw the savage-looking men from the rival organization searching the entire crash site for the Locke child, intending either to abduct her for ransom or kill her, she gathered the little girl tightly into her arms and fled into the night, disappearing without a trace. Mr. Halloran explained that he had managed to retrieve the notebook and the bracelet after they slipped from the child's hands, and for many years he had lived with a terrible conflict inside him. One part of him wanted to tell the Locke family that the girl might still be alive, while another was so terrified of that blood-soaked underworld that he didn't dare speak, because he knew that if the rival gang discovered the child had survived, they would never stop hunting her, and the kind woman who had saved her would also be placed in danger. So he chose silence and carried the secret with him until that day, when Cornelius came looking for him and he felt the time had finally arrived to release the heavy burden that had weighed upon his conscience for so many years. Delia sat listening in silence, her hands trembling, and when she saw the silver bracelet engraved with the letters A and L, a faint memory she had believed was sleeping in the deepest reaches of her mind suddenly awakened. She remembered that her adoptive mother, Wendy, had kept a secret drawer that was always locked, and once, when Delia was still a child, she had accidentally seen inside it a tiny silver bracelet exactly like this one beside an old handkerchief. Whenever she asked about them, Wendy would only smile sadly and say, "One day, I'll tell you everything, sweetheart, but not yet." Tears streamed down Delia's cheeks as the final pieces fell into place, and she understood that the simple woman who had risked her life by running into the flames to save a strange child all those years ago had been Wendy. Her mother, the poor seamstress who had carried her away from those cruel men, surrendered the peace of her own life to protect a child who shared none of her blood, and raised her for 23 years with all the love of a birth mother, without once asking for anything in return. Delia began to sob, her shoulders shaking, because only now did she truly understand the depth of Wendy's sacrifice, why the woman had always called her the gift life had given her, and why she had hidden the past for so many years to shield Delia from the dangerous world she had fought so hard to keep her away from. Through her tears, Delia silently called her mother's name, wishing Wendy were still alive so she could hold her tightly and say thank you. Marguerite crossed the room toward her, and the two women, one a mother who had lost her daughter and the other a daughter who had lost her mother, embraced and wept together in the emotion-filled room, while Cornelius quietly turned away and hurriedly wiped the corner of his eye. Fabian remained standing nearby, his heart overwhelmed by conflicting emotions, because he was filled with immeasurable joy that the family's long-lost daughter appeared to have returned. Yet at the same time, he was shaken by the realization that the love only beginning to awaken inside him now stood before a truth capable of changing everything, a truth only the approaching test results could confirm completely. 3 days later, the day the entire Locke family had awaited in breathless suspense finally arrived. When the family's trusted physician entered the grand sitting room carrying a sealed envelope, and the whole room fell into such profound silence that each person could hear the beating of their own heart. Marguerite sat gripping Delia's hand tightly. Cornelius sat upright in the armchair at the head of the room, while Fabian stood beside the window with both hands clasped behind his back, struggling to maintain his composure even as countless conflicting emotions tore through him. The doctor slowly opened the envelope, read through the results once more to make certain, then raised his eyes to the tense faces waiting before him and announced in a solemn voice that the DNA comparison between Marguerite Locke's sample and Delia Marsh's sample showed an almost absolute biological match between mother and daughter. There could no longer be any doubt. The woman sitting in that room was Adeline Locke, the daughter who had been missing from the family for 23 years. The moment those words were spoken, Marguerite broke into uncontrollable sobs and pulled Delia into her arms, holding her so tightly that it seemed she feared her newly recovered daughter might vanish into nothingness again the instant she let go. Through her tears, she called the name again and again. Adeline, my daughter, my precious girl, while her trembling hands caressed the hair and face of the child she had mourned for more than 2 decades. Delia began weeping with her, embracing the birth mother whose face she had never known, her heart overflowing with emotions too complicated to name: the joy of reunion, the grief she still carried for Wendy, the adoptive mother she had lost, and the shock of discovering that her entire life had begun with a tragedy she had never known existed. Yet in the very heart of that tearful reunion, a painful question struck Fabian's mind like an icy blade. Because if Delia truly was Adeline Locke, a biological daughter of this family, then the love that had begun to grow between them would become an unforgivable taboo, and the thought darkened his face as he stepped backward, as though he had suddenly been pushed outside the happiness of his own family. Cornelius, who had been observing everything through his deep and knowing eyes, seemed to understand the conflict tearing through his grandson, and he slowly spoke, revealing something the family had rarely discussed for many years. He said the time had come for Fabian to learn the full truth about his own origins, that Fabian wasn't a biological child of the Locke bloodline as he had always believed. Cornelius explained that many years earlier, while his only son Adeline's biological father was still alive, Fabian had been the child of a close family friend who had passed away. Cornelius had taken the orphan into his home and raised him alongside his son, giving him the Locke name and having him treat Marguerite with the respect of a nephew to an aunt. Not a single drop of Locke blood flowed through Fabian's veins. He had been officially adopted in infancy, given the Locke name, and groomed from the very beginning as the sole heir to carry the family mantle. That meant Fabian and Adeline, although they had lived beneath the same roof during the faint memories of their earliest years, had no biological connection whatsoever. They were merely 2 people whom fate had bound to the same family through the compassion of an old man. And that truth, spoken at the very moment everything had seemed hopeless, released the forbidden knot that had tightened around both Fabian's and Delia's hearts. Fabian stood motionless as Cornelius spoke, feeling the invisible weight crushing his chest suddenly dissolve, and he lifted his eyes toward Delia, the woman who had now returned as the lost daughter of the family he loved as his own, yet who was also the woman his heart had already chosen, and between those 2 roles that had seemed impossible to reconcile, there was now no barrier of blood remaining. Once Delia understood the entire truth, she looked up at him through her tears, and in the gaze they exchanged, something seemed to have been set free, a fragile hope newly kindled amid all the grief and emotion. Yet both of them understood that this wasn't the moment to think of their own love, because the joy of reunion was still overshadowed by a threat that hadn't been resolved. At the very moment the Locke family was drowning in tears of happiness over their reunion, somewhere else in the city, Bianca Frost, The imposter who had just been exposed and cast out of the luxurious home she had clung to for 2 years was swallowing her hatred, and the fury of a woman who had lost everything was driving her toward a dark alliance with the Locke family's most dangerous enemy, so that together they could prepare one final trap aimed directly at Delia, the woman who had only just found the family she had lost in childhood. After Bianca Frost's deception was exposed, and she was cast out of the Locke estate with nothing, she sought out Rourke Vance. The man she knew carried an implacable hatred for the Locke family, and was also burning for revenge after his humiliating defeat at the warehouse. And the two desperate figures quickly formed a dark alliance, nourished by hatred, because Bianca wanted to destroy the woman who had taken away the position and fortune she had believed were firmly within her grasp, while Vance wanted both to eliminate the dangerous witness who possessed the video capable of bringing down his entire criminal empire, and to strike a fatal blow at his enemy's heart by taking away the woman Fabian Locke had only just found again. They devised an elaborate trap. Bianca staged a desperate plea for help on Delia's way home, ambushing her under the guise of returning family keepsakes. Before Delia could react, Vance's men seized her and brought her to an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of the city. However, Fabian had kept a discreet eye on Delia ever since Bianca's exposure. The moment Delia failed to return home, his instincts sparked an immediate search. Inside the dark mansion, Vance stepped forward at an unhurried pace, boasting about his flawless scheme, and the vicious smile on Bianca's face made it clear that the entire meeting had been nothing more than a carefully staged performance meant to lead Delia to her death. Vance stepped forward at an unhurried pace and told her that this time no one would arrive soon enough to save her as they had at the warehouse, that he would recover the video and erase her at the same time, killing 2 birds with 1 stone, while Bianca stood beside him and bitterly declared that she should have been Adeline, that everything belonging to the Locke family should have been hers, and that if she couldn't have it, Delia wouldn't be allowed to live peacefully and enjoy it either. What neither Vance nor Bianca understood was that the Delia standing before them was no longer the frightened and lonely maid she had once been, because she had learned something from the dangerous world she had entered by accident. And more importantly, she hadn't truly come alone despite appearances. Even facing deadly danger, Delia kept her composure, deliberately prolonging the conversation to buy time. She encouraged Vance to boast about his crimes, his Braham, to the district police, and his operations in the basement, unaware that every word was being transmitted directly through a discreet tracking device Fabian had entrusted to his security detail, which was now feeding live audio straight to the authorities. At the most dangerous moment, when Vance ordered his men to seize Delia, the front door and windows of the mansion suddenly burst open. Blinding beams of flashlights swept across the room, and commanding voices rang out. FBI, nobody move. After receiving Delia's message, Fabian hadn't rushed in alone like an underworld boss as he had before. Instead, he had made a far wiser choice. He contacted a federal agent with whom he had secretly been cooperating for some time as part of his effort to leave the criminal world behind, handed over the video Delia had recorded in the basement, and provided every detail about the meeting so that the law itself could bring everything to an end. Within seconds, the mansion was filled with agents wearing protective vests. Vance's men were subdued and handcuffed with calm precision without a single shot being fired, and Vance himself stood frozen when he realized he had fallen into the very trap he believed he had created. The recording from that night, together with the video from the basement, formed 2 pieces of undeniable evidence that would bring him and his entire criminal network before the courts. Bianca Frost panicked and tried to deny everything, screaming that she was only a victim who had been manipulated. But the recording containing her own venomous admission of the plot to harm Delia exposed her completely, and when the cold handcuffs closed around the wrists of both criminals, Delia stood there with her heart still pounding, but her spirit finally lighter, watching Fabian enter behind the federal agents, and in the look they exchanged was a deep understanding that the darkness haunting them both for so long had finally been driven away, not through violence or bloodshed, but through intelligence, courage, and the power of justice. After that fateful night at the abandoned mansion, when Vance and Bianca had been taken away by the law and their entire criminal network was gradually dismantled through the evidence Delia had bravely preserved, Fabian Locke made a decision he had never dared to imagine in all his life. He chose to leave the underworld behind completely, the world that had bound his family for generations. He cooperated fully with the authorities to transform his entire empire into a lawful and transparent enterprise, accepting the loss of his dark power in exchange for a life in which he could hold his head high, because he understood that the woman who had taught his hardened heart how to feel again deserved a man who belonged to the light, not the darkness. On a peaceful afternoon beside the lake, in the garden of the estate where the entire family had finally been reunited, Fabian approached Delia, and this time there was no check. No cold proposition like the one he had made on that first fateful night. Only an honest man kneeling before the woman he loved. He told her that she had entered his life through a mistake he had turned into pain, that he had judged her before taking the time to understand who she truly was, but that she had taught him human dignity couldn't be purchased with money, and a person's worth wasn't measured by appearance or social status. He asked her to give him the chance to love and cherish her every day for the rest of his life, not as a secret or a transaction, but as the true wife of his heart. With tears shining in her eyes, Delia nodded and said yes, because after every storm they had endured together, she understood that the man before her had truly changed, that he had rediscovered the humanity the darkness had nearly consumed. And amid Marguerite's applause and tears of happiness, a moment of healing came to every wounded heart within that house. It was then that Cornelius Locke slowly stepped forward, wearing the gentle yet slightly mischievous smile of an old man who had seen deeply into life, and confessed something that left everyone astonished. He revealed that shortly after the funeral of Delia's adoptive mother, he had quietly ordered an investigation into the dutiful young maid who had arranged her mother's burial with such devotion, because an instinct and several faint clues surrounding the birthmark had made him suspect that she might be the missing Adeline. Yet instead of immediately arranging a blood test, he had deliberately ensured that she was hired by the company and allowed fate to bring her closer to the family, because he wanted to test whether her heart was truly good before testing her blood. He said that sometimes destiny needed the gentlest push, and that what he had longed to recover had never merely been an heir, but a person of genuine character, and Delia had proven the goodness of her heart through the dignity and compassion she had preserved throughout every trial. Before stepping into her new life, Delia also made sure to care for Nora Bishop, securing her loyal friend a safe and well-paid managerial position within one of the group's legitimate hospitality branches, ensuring she would never face danger again. Even in the fullness of that happiness, Delia didn't forget the mother who had given her life a second time. She went with the entire Locke family to visit Wendy Marsh's grave, where they placed white flowers, and through her tears Delia whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for saving me from the flames. Thank you for raising me with all your love even though you owed me nothing. You gave me this life twice, once when you risked your own life to save me, and once when you taught me how to live with kindness and hold my head high. Even though I've found my origins now, you will always be the mother in my heart, the greatest woman I've ever known." Delia's story didn't end with revenge or the triumph of power, but with healing, with love, and with the victory of self-respect. And if there is one lesson we can carry with us from her journey, it is that a person's true worth never lies in their weight, appearance, wealth, or social position, but in the dignity, goodness, and kindness they hold on to even under the harshest circumstances. Every human being, no matter how deeply society may look down upon them, deserves the same respect and love as anyone else. And sometimes the humblest and quietest people are the ones who carry the noblest hearts. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can join us in discovering many more meaningful and compelling stories every day. We would also love to know how you feel. What do you think about Delia's journey? And what does this story make you reflect upon in our own real lives, where we sometimes judge others by their appearance and forget the true worth hidden within them? Please leave a comment and share the thoughts resting deepest in your heart, because every story you tell may become a source of inspiration and healing for someone else who is quietly listening. Thank you for taking the time to remain with us until the final moments of this story. We wish everyone watching this video excellent health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in our next videos. Take care, and we hope to see you again very soon.